Chakraborty, partner Aavishkaar Capital, will be further deep diving on climate investing. Please take the stage.
Give us a few seconds and then pull it on. The tech capital, but tech sometimes fails. Yeah, great. Yeah. Let's go back. Great, thank you for that. Yeah, so we heard, climate is part of every conversation. We just heard Mr. Sinha talk about the urgency of climate. We all know about that. I'm actually going to talk to you more about communities. I'm from Aavishkaar Capital. For those of us who don't know us, most of you know us, we are impact investors. We invest for communities. Our vision statement is to create opportunities for the emerging 3 billion. So when we looked at the climate problem, we looked at it from the lens of what it does for the communities and how can we involve the communities in creating a solution for climate for us. What we agree we must do, and you just heard Mr. Sinha as well talking about net zero is net positive. We all know.
Hey guys, it looks a little rude. We are all in the same room. We have a presentation going on. I would like to request everyone to please grab a chair. We have enough time for networking after 5. So rest be assured, we will all get enough time to network and exchange cards and exchange notes and everything. If you can just please be seated till the panel, it will be really great. Thank you so much. Please.
Thank you for that. Mr. Sinha, was on video, obviously. Unfortunately, I'm in the room, so, you get that speech. So just starting again, I think we all agree that, net zero has to be achieved. Net zero is net positive. We all agree that, emissions have to be reduced. We have to get to a net zero. But how do we get to a net zero? We don't get to a net zero just by reducing emissions. There are going to be hard to abate emissions which are not going to go away, and we'll still have them. So the only way to get to net zero is actually to have offsets, right? That's the part that we don't talk about as much, and I'm going to talk to you today primarily about that. Now, what does this create? It creates an opportunity to do a lot of climate investing, right? We talked about trillions of dollars here. As IFC, there's a report, $23 trillion needs to go into climate. We heard lots of big numbers from Mr. Sinha just now, right? So we all agree there needs to be a lot of investing. We are investors in the room. We need to be investing in this, right? Where are these investments being made today, right? Where we look at the large investments being made today, they are being made in solar panels, in energy largely, renewable energy, solar, wind, electric mobility, reducing emissions. That's where we agree most of the capital needs to go. 80% of the solution is actually in that, right? Which is what is happening. But we clearly need a lot more of that, right? And we agree we need a lot more of that. Who is this guy now? Why is he in the picture here, right? I mean, who is this guy Tapan Das, and why is he part of this conversation? Now, there's one angle to why we need to talk about people like Tapan Das, is because agriculture contributes about 14-15% of the emissions. People like him actually bear 80% of the brunt of climate change. They live at what we call as climate thresholds, right? So they are close to nature, they work outside, climate change affects them the most. But I'm not here to talk to you today about why we must do things for him, but how we involve him in a solution for climate change as investors, and how do we do that, right? Now, who is he? He's a farmer in a village called Badiguri in northeast of India, in Bengal. He's a farmer, he farms. He can only farm once a year in the Kharif season because he can only do rain-fed agriculture. He doesn't have the resources to invest in irrigation, and therefore he only farms once a year. The rest of the time, he actually travels to Kerala to work in the tourism sector, right? So that's his story. What do we do about him? And what is his solution that fits into an investment here, right? So he has a piece of land, which is about an acre, in which he farms, but he actually has another couple of acres in which he does not farm. And the reason for that are manifold, including not having enough irrigation, not having the resources and so on. But he does have land, which is an asset, which he needs to do more with, right? What he's willing to do is to put in a lot of hard work and take care of that land and the assets that you build on that land, right? What he does not have is actually capital. He needs capital to invest in that, and he needs knowledge on how to maximize productivity of that land, right? So why are we talking about him now? This goes back to what we said right in the beginning. We need to get to net zero. Now, how do we get to net zero? We need negative emissions. Guess where the negative emissions come from? About 100% or 99.9% of those emissions today come from nature. They come from growing trees. They come from regenerative agriculture, which stores carbon in the soil. They come from protection of mangroves, right? All of this is natural carbon sequestration. Almost 100% of the offsets today come from there. If you look at projections, multiple projections, obviously depends on how technology progresses and so on. But any estimate you'll see, it'll show you that more than 50%, even by 2050, is going to come from negative emissions, from nature-based negative emissions, right? Now, who protects nature and who takes care of nature? These are the people like Tapan Das. You have this lady called Shanti Oran from a nearby village. You have Mohammad Faisal. These are the custodians of nature, right? These are the people who we need to invest in to get those offsets. How do we include him in a climate investment? We create a fund which invests in an investee company, which is what we understand, which actually invests in the community. These are large communities of people. This is not investing in one person, which is too small. These investments, just to give you a scale of these investments, this can involve 5,000, 10,000 farmers. The size of each of these investments can be anywhere from $5 million to $20 million, right? You invest in them how? You give them saplings, you give them inputs, you give them training to, one, preserve more carbon in their soil, but also to plant trees and take care of mangroves and things like that wherever they sit, right? This is what they do. They do agroforestry. They grow trees in those 2 acres that Tapan Das had where he's not doing anything, and if you can't do agriculture, then you plant trees in that. You also plant trees in between his agricultural fields. He does regenerative agriculture, which preserves carbon in the soil, and he can restore mangroves. What do we get in return? So what he does for us in return is he actually gives back he assigns the rights to the carbon credits to the investee. Some of those rights can be left with him, but that's details. The investee then sells the carbon credits in a market, which I'll tell you about, to get cash back, which is what creates returns for the fund. Now this is a highly investable market, which is what I'm going to try and show to you next. So what are the prospects of this carbon market? So the voluntary carbon, there are lots of carbon markets. Very broadly for people who don't know, there are the compliance regulatory markets. Mr. Sinha just talked about the ETS market. I'm talking about the voluntary market, which is driven by commitments made by corporates to buy more offsets, right? So that market was about 360 million tons in size. That's projected to go to about somewhere between 1.5 to 2 billion, about 4 to 5x growth by 2030. By 2050, it's got to grow by about 20 to 35x. Now that number between 7 to 13 gigatons is what you saw as the offsets by 2050. So that's where really that number comes from. So that's a market just in terms of volumes has to grow by that. If you look at values, it depends on where carbon prices go, which can go anywhere from, today it's around $15, $20 per ton for projects like these. It could go anywhere from $80 to $100 per ton, depending on, how fast the demand moves, right? Why is this market growing? Because corporates are being pushed by their stakeholders to come up with net zero commitments, right? That's primarily what is pushing this market, right? You have more than a third of the companies, about 600 companies are signing on to net zero commitments every quarter now. And these are large global corporates, right? So the stakeholder demands, the supportive regulations, which are obviously essential under the Paris Agreement and so on. And there's a price for carbon being discovered. There's a clear recognition that unless you price carbon, people are not going to invest in this, right? Unless you really price that, people are not going to do it. So what are we doing? This is just to show you how it can be real. So we're raising a fund, I think Vineet just mentioned that, which is investing, which will invest a lot more, which is already starting to invest on the ground. This is the project where Shanti Oran and Tapan Das comes from. It's about 10,000 hectares. We plant about 7 million trees in the fields owned by the farmers, generate about 1 million tons or more, 5,000 farmers involved. It's a 20-year project, which this also tells you it's going to be a longer-term fund, right? So this strategy comes with a longer-term vision. This I would put to you as a very high, unique sort of high impact strategy which takes care of climate, community, and biodiversity, all of it put together. Biodiversity elements are something that you got to factor in this as well. It actually gives you climate and financial returns for investing directly in the community. There are lots of spin-offs on climate tech, which is what a lot of us understand. You know, there are carbon markets being developed, exchanges being developed, there's monitoring and reporting, verification technologies being developed. We should invest in all of that to also support this market. But we can also directly invest in this to get all the offsets we want. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanchayan.